The Afghan government and the Taliban say they've reached a breakthrough. They'll press ahead with talks on a political roadmap and a ceasefire. 2 decades of conflict have killed tens of thousands of people. So what chance is there for lasting peace? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. After months of discussions in Qatar's capital, Doha, the Afghan government and the Taliban are finally taking up an opportunity for peace. The two sides have agreed on a set of rules that would allow substantive negotiations to start. The breakthrough aims to put an end to almost 2 decades of conflict. Not many details have been given on the political agenda or when the talks will begin. The Afghan government has repeatedly demanded Taliban fighters stop their attacks, but the group has refused to agree to a ceasefire until other issues have been resolved. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani reiterated his demand for a truce. The president's spokesman tweeted, "The agreement is a step forward towards beginning the negotiations on the main issues, including a comprehensive ceasefire, as the key demand of the Afghan people." 3 main sticking points halted progress during the first direct talks between the warring sides in September. Now, as negotiations are set to enter the next phase, some of those differences appear to have been resolved. The Taliban has insisted that the Hanafi school of Islamic thought should form the legal basis for the talks. The government wanted to guarantee the inclusion of religious minorities. And the two sides have differed on whether a US Taliban deal reached in February would be the basis of negotiations. Now, the deal between the US and Taliban has paved the way for the so-called intra-Afghan talks. Under the agreement, foreign troops would be pulled out from Afghanistan by May, but that is in exchange for security guarantees by Taliban fighters. NATO has about 11,000 troops in Afghanistan. Its Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, welcomed the breakthrough.
The agreement today is, you can discuss whether it's a big or a small step, but the important thing is that it's the first step. It's the first time actually Taliban and the Afghan government are able to sign a document agreeing on the framework, the modalities for negotiations addressing a long-term peaceful solution, how to reach peace in Afghanistan.
The announcement comes as the US is set to cut down its troop levels in Afghanistan to 2,500. President Donald Trump has ordered the drawdown to take place by mid-January, just days before President-elect Joe Biden is expected to take office. There have been calls for Biden to review the peace process with the Taliban, whose fighters have been blamed for a series of attacks since the deal was signed. Let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we have Omar Samad, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also a former spokesman for the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a former advisor to Afghan Chief Executive Abdullah. From Kabul, we're joined by Mushtaq Rahim, a founding member of Afghanistan Affairs Unit think tank. And also in Washington, D.C., Richard Ponzio, director of the Just Security 2020 programme at the Stimson Centre and a former US State Department advisor on Afghanistan. Welcome to you all. Omar Samad, if I can begin with you, this seems like something of an early victory for the Taliban, doesn't it? They've kept up the violence. OK, they've avoided US and NATO troops, but not Afghan civilians. And they've got a small deal with the Afghan government.
Well, I think it's a relative positive success step for all sides. And most importantly, I think it gives a bit of hope to the Afghan people who, as you said, are victims of violence from all sides. Let's remember that violence, unfortunately, is obviously carried out by Taliban, who use it tactically against certain targets, and then also in a defensive or offensive manner by government forces, and sometimes still international forces when it's needed. So it is a step, but it opens the door for the next stage, which is to talk about what items to discuss down the road. So it's to set the agenda for substantive talks. Now, we are not at substantive talks yet. This is going to be another difficult stage, in my opinion. I think both sides are ready. They have gotten to know each other. They are well versed in some of the issues, but it's going to take a bit of time and effort. It's important that the environment around them, outside of the room, also be conducive to helping the peace process move forward.
Okay. Mushtaq, it's taken since September and lots of painstaking talks to get to where we are, just this agreement. Is there something positive to see out of the first agreement between the two sides in 19 years?
Well, not in 19 years, but let's say in last 4 decades, for the first time, we're seeing the two opposing Afghan parties are sitting across the table to each other. And I think that's a significant progress in the history of the Afghan conflict. But as we all know, that's really the first step, and very tiny step considering the size of the issues that are in front of the negotiating teams, where they will be discussing the issues related to the future makeup of the Afghan state system. The way the government, the power sharing issues will be discussed, how will the constitution will uphold. So yes, definitely, it's a very good first step, positive step, because there were concerns that after Trump administration that had led the negotiation with the Taliban and successfully signed the Doha agreement, since they were going out of the office and new administration was coming, there were some skeptics around the issue. Now that we are seeing progress in the intra-Afghan talks, there are hopes that the process will certainly move forward and will give an opportunity, a chance to the peace process to succeed.
Okay, Richard, is this something of perhaps a small victory for the Taliban? They've kept up these violent attacks, albeit avoiding US and NATO soldiers, and they've managed to negotiate some sort of a preliminary deal, if you like, with the Afghan government.
You know, this does fit with the stalling strategy of the Taliban over the previous year, really running down the clock against the U.S. troop withdrawal, part of the U.S. agreement in February of this year. But I would say, as my two colleagues on the panel have noted, it is an important step forward. I would not call it a breakthrough, as the United Nations and others in the media have announced. It's not even, certainly not the end of the process, not even the beginning of the end, but the beginning of the formal negotiations. Let's not overstate that these were procedural agreements. I understand around 24 that were agreed upon. It sets the basis, though, for the serious work to begin. As my colleagues have noted, just getting a ceasefire is probably going to be intermittent ceasefires towards a durable, lasting solution. This is when the real work begins, and there are huge disagreements still between the Taliban and the Afghan government.
Omar, Richard mentioned there this running down of the clock. There is going to be, the main demand is going to be for the Taliban to cease fire before there's any substantive talks. Considering the Taliban have been unwilling to do that, is that a realistic prospect?
Well, all sides have their own clock. Let's be realistic, okay? Kabul has its own clock. Mr. Ghani is running his clock, and it's tied to his politics and his power base. Other Afghan politicians have theirs, and they're worried. The Afghan people obviously want things to happen as soon as possible because they are under pressure. Washington has its clock now. It's going to be handed over to another team, as predicted. And the region, the countries around Afghanistan have theirs, and they obviously are watching very carefully, hedging, depending on how the wind blows. So it's a very complex situation. As far as the ceasefire is concerned, Bernard, I think that for the Taliban, this ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, is very much tied to the end state or a certain stage within substantive talks that deals with a future government. I think that they realize that it's sort of a give and take, not that they should be using that against Afghan civilians by any means, but it is obviously a leverage that they are using, political leverage, that is tied to something substantive on the political front, which probably opens the door to maybe a transitional system or transitional administration in Afghanistan later on. We don't know at what stage. We don't even know if others will cooperate with that, and who will spoil and who will enable, who will disable. So there are a lot of questions ahead, but I think what we should expect at this point is put pressure on the Taliban for reduction in violence. They need to make sure that civilians are protected, that there's some type of agreement, some type of protocol on reducing violence that aims and targets civilians mainly, and hoping for further ceasefire issues down the road.
Mushtaq, Omar talking there sounds like something that's not quite exactly a ceasefire, but a reduction in violence. But the government is going to ask for a ceasefire, isn't it? Is it going to get that, or is it going to end up... the Taliban has got leverage because it has continued its attacks. What are we going to see?
You see, any negotiating party will maintain an ace in their hand in order to get into negotiation and try to seek concessions or collect leverage on the negotiation table. The Afghan government will continue to push for the ceasefire, and so as the Taliban will try to push and talk about the future setup of the government, what sort of state system. So they will maintain this bargaining chip in their hands while going into the talks. But both sides know that none of the two issues that they are presenting are going to be accepted as comprehensively as they think. Particularly the issue of ceasefire. You know, the Taliban cannot go into the ceasefire until they are quite sure of concrete progress in terms of reaching an agreement with the Afghan government. And the reason is that the Taliban experienced this for 3 days during the Eid holidays 3 years back, where they lost control of their fighters on the ground who came out in media and demanded the peace process, peaceful settlement. So that's why they are using it as possible zone of agreement. They're using it as a bargaining chip, but both sides know that this is not going to what they will achieve ultimately.
Richard, we know that the Afghan government is very nervous about this rapid drawdown of US troops. Would the Afghan government be wise to try and stall or delay the talks advancing any further until President-elect Joe Biden's in the White House? Would he be different in his approach to Afghanistan, do you think, Joe Biden? Would he continue the drawdown?
I think the reason we saw the progress this week in Doha is precisely because of the outcome of the U.S. election results, the Taliban knowing they're not going to have the same relationship with the United States as they have currently with the Trump administration. Many in Washington and elsewhere, certainly European capitals, are worried that the U.S. is abandoning its commitment to conditions-based drawdown, seeing this reduction in violence that our other two commentators have referred to. It's a clear violation of the agreement from February. Another violation by the Taliban has been their commitment to counterterrorism commitments. The connections to the Al-Qaeda in particular continue, as reported in the Security Council as recently as this past May. Yes, they've been attacking ISIS. I think there's common cause against the Islamic State. But these two violations, meanwhile, the U.S. has been withdrawing. That's its commitment. And finally, the start of the negotiations. They have started in earnest. But the key point is that the Taliban needs to live up to its part of the agreement if the U.S. is going to follow through on its deal. At the same time, the U.S. is going to note to the Afghan government that it's not going to have a military presence forever, and it needs to put positive pressure on both sides to make progress towards a durable political solution.
Omar, Richard points out there that the Taliban's violations of the February agreement in the last year, would it be worth the Afghan government hanging on a bit until the Biden administration comes in? Would it slow down the drawdown of troops that the Afghan government is so worried about?
Listen, we don't know what the Biden administration is going to do. The Biden administration has a very, very full plate internally, domestically, and internationally. Afghanistan, I'm sure they would like to not have to deal with Afghanistan at this point. And there is an opportunity, there is an opportunity once in a lifetime opportunity to put an end to this war. But this war has to be put into an end, obviously, responsibly. Responsibly doesn't just mean that the Taliban have to do this or this country has to do this. Responsibly means that all sides have to be responsible. That includes people in Kabul, that includes people in the region, that includes people in Washington. There are those in Washington who are calling for more war in Afghanistan. That is insane. There are people who are calling for a total immediate reduction in forces and pullout. That is also somewhat insane. So we need to find the right formula that works, keeping the Afghan people in mind and realizing that the war it has in some ways ended because one side probably has lost, but we don't want to call it a loss or a defeat. And we need to make sure that the Afghans come together and rebuild their country and form a government of their choosing. We can't impose things on Afghanistan anymore. Too many things have been imposed and they have all backfired. And the region, again, I come to the region because they have to play an important role balancing. So we have to balance the region, we have to balance Afghan politics and the different interests, and we have to balance external great power politics as well. And so all of that requires good diplomacy. And I think that what we need to do is focus more on diplomacy and active and constructive diplomacy. And I hope the Biden administration does that.
Mushtaq, Omar mentioned there the need to give the Afghan people a government of their choosing. On Wednesday, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, he said that the most common way that insurgencies end is through a power-sharing negotiated settlement. Is this where you see this ultimately ending up?
Well, I mean, ideally, yes. Any sort of insurgency will end up in giving a share to the warring parties, allowing them to join. But the problem is that the Taliban have been quite adamant on their demand that they want the re-establishment of their regime that was toppled by the US intervention in the post 9/11 action, the Operation Enduring Freedom that was implemented by the United States. So that's the sticking point. Otherwise, indeed, the power sharing is something that's going to resolve. You have to share the pie with those who have been fighting for it for the last 2 decades. They have been able to challenge the international forces, the domestic forces. They have been able to call the shots as far as the negotiation between the Taliban and Khalilzad is concerned over the course of last couple of years. They have been dominating. They have a lot of leverage. And that's why power sharing will be an ideal scenario. But then the Taliban will have to show a bit of flexibility, particularly learning from the history, the Afghan history. Back in late 80s, when the same sort of arrangements were being struck by the international community as part of Geneva process, the Mujahideen groups did not agree to any sort of power sharing, and we all know we ended up in civil war. That's the worry, that's the concern here in Afghanistan, that the rigidity is going to challenge the success of this whole process. There has to be flexibility, there has to be concessions, and it has to be with the positive vibes as far as the peace process is concerned. The adamancy, the rigid attitude is going to challenge. So yes, the power sharing is the solution. The makeup and its outlook has to be worked out.
Richard, I have to say it might seem incredible to some that there's even a possibility of any power sharing future, given the duration of these talks since September, given the difficulties between the Afghan government itself, between the two sides, and who won their own presidential election. Can you ever see a power sharing agreement in Afghanistan being agreed between these parties?
It's absolutely essential in some form or another. A version of the current constitutional order since the beginning of the bond process 19 years ago is critical, but it has to include the Taliban this time. Let's not forget, though, if it's just a power sharing agreement among elites, that's not going to pass the test for durable, certainly inclusive process of governance and preserving the gains that the Afghan government and its society have overseen for the past 2 decades. Human rights, especially women's rights, lots of gains, getting children back to schools, health indicators. They need to build on that progress. And also, it's not just foreign forms of democracy that will be essential. They can still lean on traditional tools such as the Loya Jirga mechanism, which again was used 2 decades ago among the various warring factions. As my previous colleague just noted, the Geneva process failed, but those same parties came around the table and worked on a new constitutional order in the early 2000s. It's time, though, that the next phase begins with some kind of interim arrangement that the parties can agree to, and then have the Taliban fully brought into the system. A final point, though, building on Ambassador Samad's point about diplomacy, there's a critical role. The United States can apply pressure on both sides as the other major conflict to the party of the conflict, but it's really a possibility of mediation. The United Nations has a critical peacemaking role, but there are other regional players from Uzbekistan to Qatar that might be asked by the parties. They'll need to, of course, welcome them in. And finally, the other regional partners can reinforce this process. Many of them, of course, are undermining peace in Afghanistan.
Omar, Richard mentioned there the Loya Jirga. This was in 2001. The Bonn Agreement did this, created an interim government. Would the current democratically elected government in Kabul agree to something like that? Would you see them having to agree to something like that to pave the way?
Well, listen, I was in Bonn. I was in this government for many years. I know how much gains we've had and how much gains we have not had, how much has been wasted, how much corruption exists, how fragile everything else is. We need to be realistic. The Taliban are in control of a lot of places in the country. Kabul and many cities are surrounded by Taliban. We need a settlement soon, and we need to take Afghan realities into account and not just PR. I think that it's important to learn the lessons from the past. It's important to maintain the core gains that the Afghan people ascribe to.
Okay.
And it's important. Remember, Geneva, the majority were not at the table.
Yeah.
This is the first time that there's an intra-Afghan, even though this is not totally representative, but it's the most intra-Afghan that we've had so far. In Geneva, it was against a Soviet occupation, and the Afghan people rose up, and eventually they had to do what they had to do. In this case, let's hope that we end up not with another Soviet-type withdrawal or another Vietnam as the U.S. experienced. Let's hope we do not create another Vietnam. So there are a lot of lessons from history, and I hope that we apply the right measures and do not politicize this beyond what is needed.
All right. One last question to you, Mushtaq. I'm afraid it's got to be a short answer, but it's a long issue, a complicated issue, I know. But Pakistan, how relevant is Pakistan now? Because the current leadership or leading the talks here in Doha is not as connected to Pakistan as previous Taliban leaders might have been. So do we have to worry about Pakistan as much now? Last.
Absolutely, at all times. And the reason I can give you is that, yes, you have the negotiating team sitting in Doha, disconnected from the influence of the Pakistanis. But then don't forget that people sitting in Doha, why are they influential and how are they calling the shots? What is the reason? Because they have been dominant on the battlefield, and battlefield is again dependent on the Pakistani side of the Durand line, and because of the military outfits that are operating from the sanctuaries from there and getting support from beyond the Durand line and from within Pakistan, that gives leverage to the Taliban in Doha. And as such, the Pakistani side of the game continues to dominate. They are important, and they will remain relevant up until end of this whole process.
All right. Gentlemen, so much more to talk about on Afghanistan, but unfortunately we are out of time. But thank you to Omar Samad, to Mushtaq Rahim and to Richard Ponzio. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.